12. Coercion. A society without coercion is often dreamed of by humanistic revolutionists. Anarchism is, of course, that philosophy which maintains that man can find fulfillment only in a non-status, voluntaristic and non-coercive society. Libertarianism is increasingly an openly anarchistic and relativistic philosophy. Since the libertarian definition of anarchism is the best, let us examine this position as defined by Karl Hess, who, in the 1964 presidential campaign, was Senator Goldwater's writer. Libertarianism is the view that each man is the absolute owner of his life, to use and dispose of as he sees fit, that all men's social actions should be voluntary, and that respect for every other man's similar and equal ownership of life, and, by extension, the property and fruits of that life, is the ethical basis of a humane and open society. Moreover, Hess states, each man is a sovereign land of liberty, with his primary allegiance to himself. For Hess, man is not a sinner, but rather his own God. The sinner, the great evil, is the state. As he analyses liberals and conservatives on the issue of the state, Hess states, just as power is the God of the modern liberal, God remains the authority of the modern conservative. Liberalism practices regimentation by, simply, regimentation. Conservatism practices regimentation by, not quite so simply, revelation. But, regimented or revealed, the name of the game is still politics. The great flaw in conservatism is a deep fissure down which talk of freedom falls, to be dashed to death on the rocks of authoritarianism. Conservatives worry that the state has too much power over people, but it was conservatives who gave the state that power. Murray Rothbard, writing in Ramparts, has summed up this flawed conservatism in describing a new, younger generation of rightists, of conservatives, who thought that the real problem of the modern world was nothing so ideological as the state versus individual liberty, or government intervention versus the free market. The real problem, they declared, was the preservation of tradition, order, Christianity, and good manners against the modern sins of reason, license, atheism, and boorishness. For many conservatives, the bad dream that haunts their lives and their political position, which many sum up as law and order these days, is one of riot. To my knowledge, there is no limit that conservatives would place upon the power of the state to suppress riots. Hess is right in stating that the conservative rests on revelation, that is, on the preservation of Christianity. And it is the failure of conservatism that it fails to see this, that it attempts to defend on humanistic premises a Christian product. But what does Hess's position rest on? The belief in man's goodness, man's ability to live without coercion or violence, and in the sovereignty of man, does not rest on either experience, history, or reason. Hess here provides his own revelation out of himself. He calls for communities of voluntarism and summons man to go it alone metaphysically in a world more of reason than religion. While calling his position not quite anarchy, Hess does not distinguish it from anarchism. Modern libertarianism rests on a radical relativism. No law or standard exists apart from man himself. Some libertarian professors state in classes and in conversation that any position is valid as long as it does not claim to be the truth, and that therefore biblical religion is the essence of evil to them. There must be, according to these libertarians, a total free market of ideas and practices. If all men are angels, then a total free market of ideas and practices will produce only an angelic community. But if all men are sinners in need of Christ's redemption, then a free market of ideas and practices will produce only a chaos of evil and anarchy. Both the libertarian and the biblical positions rest on faith. The one on faith in the natural goodness of man, the other on God's revelation concerning man's sinful state and glorious potential in Christ. Clearly, the so-called rational faith of such irrationalism as Hess and Rothbard represent has no support in the history of man, nor in any formulation of reason. It is a faith, and a particularly blind faith in man which they represent. A cardinal reason for the growing lawlessness of the 20th century is precisely relativism and moral anarchism. An inquiring reporter in Fremont, California, asking, "Should unrestricted abortions be legalized in California?" received, among others, this answer from AWS, a retired salesman. "Yes, a woman should be able to have one if that's what she wants. It's up to the individual. In a way, it is taking a human life, but if it's a medical necessity, regardless of the person's wishes, it should be done." Let us examine this statement. First, it is admitted that abortion is taking a human life, that is, it's murder. But second, it is further asserted that a woman has this power over her fetus. It's up to the individual. What is hers is also hers to dispose of or to murder. By logic, this position, which holds to the individual's anarchic freedom, means also that a fetus, as a subordinate life, has no such freedom. Does this mean that a mother, as a superior person, can dispose of an unwanted child by murder? Or a couple rid themselves of aged parents by murder? This is an implicit position because, third, the woman's desire to retain the fetus can be overruled. But if it's a medical necessity, regardless of the person's wishes, it should be done. In other words, more powerful and knowing persons in S's anarchistic society can decree death in terms of superior scientific wisdom. In an anarchistic world, where man is his only law, the consequences of anarchism are violence to the weak by the stronger and the destruction of intelligence by brute force. When the humanist deals with evil, he resorts to evasion to efface man's guilt. Thus, Steve Allen has observed, "I'm not completely convinced of it, but I think there is almost no evil intent in the world." This distinction between intent and act, now so basic to humanistic law, goes back to Greek philosophy and to Aristotle. It is ironic that modern humanists who rail against dualism should themselves resort to it so heavily. In terms of this distinction, a murderer can escape from the death penalty. The courts now are ready to regard the death penalty as possibly cruel and unusual punishment, and hence illegal. One of the California cases involved is of a man guilty of 3 murders in much less than a decade. In this kind of consideration for the murderer, the victim's rights are lost and denied. In biblical law, the act is the intent. A murder involves a murderous intent. If an axe handle obviously breaks accidentally and suddenly flies and kills a man, the act is an accident, and the intent and act are thus not murder, so the penalty is not for murder. Because history so clearly manifests evil, it is only by resorting to the dualistic distinction between intent, spirit, and act, matter, that humanism is able to claim a natural goodness, or at least a neutral nature for man. How then does humanism account for the obviously evil intent of men who flagrantly broke the law during the Boston police strike? Or how shall they explain the 1969 violences in Pakistan, such as cited in this report? Dhaka, East Pakistan, UPI. Political turmoil in East Pakistan has spawned numerous people's courts in the interior that are summarily issuing sentences of death by clubbing or knifing, government sources and travellers reported Tuesday. Madness is sweeping the rural areas, said one traveller on arriving here. He said he has spent the past week in villages and towns north of Dhaka. No one is safe, he said. Servants can turn against masters. He said the people's courts have no juries and always issue the death sentence, which is carried out immediately by peasants wielding clubs or knives. It is to be noted that the flagrant evil of the Nazis is omitted here, and the most flagrant evil of the Soviet communists. How are all these things explained? The title of the Pakistan report reveals the answer. Madness sweeps Pakistan. Similarly, a book review of Stalin's Reign of Terror is titled Mad Efficacy for Extermination. This is the answer. It's not that man is a sinner, but that social conditions have incited man to this reflex action, which is at worst madness, and at best revolutionary heroism. Such reasoning rests on a blind faith in man which is immune to facts. Moreover, because humanistic thinking cannot account for evil except as a temporary madness, and its answer after Rubinov is to give expression to this madness in order to exercise it, humanism cannot deal with evil or coercion honestly. It denies evil in man as the basic fact concerning fallen man's nature, and then it denies the legitimacy of coercion. The two facts are related. If man, as in humanism, is his own God, then how can that God be coerced? Coercion becomes then the great evil for a logical humanism. Is coercion ever legitimate? The Bible clearly has laws against coercion in some forms, such as murder, kidnapping, and the like. Thus, in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 17 to 22, it is declared that he that killeth any man shall surely be put to death, and he that killeth a beast shall make it good, beast for beast. And if a man cause a blemish in his neighbour, as he hath done, so shall it be done to him. Breach for breach, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he hath caused a blemish in a man, so shall it be done to him again. And he that killeth a beast, he shall restore it. And he that killeth a man, he shall be put to death. Ye shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger, as for one of your own country. For I am the Lord your God. The laws here stated appear also in Exodus chapter 21, verses 12 following, verses 24 and 25, verses 33 and 34. It is the principle of restitution and the death penalty. Unlawful coercion faces a severe penalty in biblical law. The murderer, as the man guilty of the most extreme form of physical coercion, must, without exception, be put to death. But it must be noted, coercion against evildoers is the required and inescapable duty of the civil authority. God requires coercion in the suppression of lawlessness. Without godly coercion, the world is surrendered into the hands of ungodly coercion. No man wants a hose of water turned against his living room, but in case of fire, that water is a necessity and a welcome help. Similarly, coercion is a God-ordained necessity to enable man to cope with outbreaks of lawlessness. The humanistic perspective is schizophrenic. Because of its basic dualism, it denies responsibility. Intent and act are divorced. Works of evil then become not an expression of man's sinful heart, but a form of strange madness. Man himself is basically good, or, at worst, after Rubinoff, neutral, part angel and part devil. Instead of restraint, humanism demands self-expression. This, of course, is the death of law and order and the rise of massive anarchy and coercion. In the name of abolishing coercion, humanism ensures its triumph in the form of lawless violence.